40, 50 years that I've been involved with therapeutic communities and trying to advance this whole approach, which is an approach that I didn't create. You know, this was created by the participants themselves. You can understand that. Even though a lot of people read my books and writings and they think, you know, that they somehow, they conclude that somehow I made this happen, you know. Well, I take a certain, here's as much as a bow that I take on that. There were many fathers and mothers to this approach, and I'm just one of them. And the key is, 50 years I've watched the arc of this approach occur. And the whole, if anybody's listening to this, we want to think about Amity aside for the moment, because I see them, as I mentioned, as the oasis and the possible, providing a new possible leadership for revitalization. But the arc of the approach of the therapeutic community, or community as method as I came to term it, has been, you know, up, 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 and then level, and then maybe down, down, down. The down part has to do with, you know, the gradual erosion or loss, paradoxically, of community itself. You've got programs, you've got organizations, they have contracts, they're serving populations, they claim to be doing treatment and human services, but we knew that the great power of this approach really rested in the ability to generate actual, what we call community as method. That is, and here's part of this I want to emphasize, which is when a community is a method, this is free association, folks, so you'll forgive me if it's not that coherent. When a community is a method, it really means that there is a kind of a planned approach to how we want to achieve a goal. And of course our goal is the transformation of lives and lifestyles. That's what the original therapeutic communities did. They went much beyond the issue of using drugs. That's how you got here, but what has to change is your whole life, and in many cases your identity. How to do that required that every single participant in that community had to make that happen for each other. So I'm a psychologist, so what I learned early on when I was part of the first Phoenix House communities is that, look, this is what was going on here, which is the method that was going on, unfolding here, was that every single member of this community was being trained to use the rest of the community to change themselves, which I then essentially reframed as a definition of community as method. Community is a method when it, in effect, teaches you, we, the community, will teach you, the individual, how to use us, the community, to change yourself. You will learn here how you can use the entire social and physical environment to change yourself. In the end, although we hear all about community as method, in the end it's about the individual. That the individual who is essentially engaging in this, if you want to call it as a method, they're learning how to use an entire community, all of its resources, namely its people, of course, but there's also the physical environment and the activities of that day, how to use all of that to change yourself. And that really, I saw that in the early days. The participants were simply doing it. They weren't thinking theoretically or conceptually. They were just doing it by trial and error. They were discovering the whole approach. The very approach that you're involved, some of you may be involved in these days, really begins with the first generation of participants essentially discovering that and learning that on a trial and error basis. You know, why do we have a morning meeting? Why do we have to have essentially corrections and affirmations? Why do we have to have disciplinary actions? Why do we have to have job functions? What's the meaning of all that? All of that, of course, they were discovering on a trial and error basis, but what was being built was a very profound methodology, which is, take an entire environment, people and activities, convert that into one goal, which is to help an individual change their lives and their identities. That's the driving rationale behind communities method, and as you've been hearing, I think it's a good definition now. a community teaches an individual to use the community to change themselves. There's a lot of communities in the world. There's even a lot of therapeutic communities. The word therapeutic means to heal. Well, our kinds of therapeutic communities certainly had healing effects. I've always tried to make the distinction between the general, broad class of therapeutic communities, which has the word therapeutic, which means healing, to distinguish that from a community as method, which includes not only healing properties, but teaching properties. So what is distinctive about the 20th, 21st century therapeutic community is that it borrowed from the ancient therapeutic communities 2,000 years ago, including the original Christian communities, the healing properties. What are the healing properties? Well, we say these are communities where you come in here and people feel better, their emotions get better, their injuries improve. That's the healing part. And of course we know that's absolutely necessary for individuals to change or to begin to try to change again in life. But what is distinctive about the community as a method approach is its heavy, heavy emphasis on how much you have to learn. So it's not only, you're here and the words like support and empathy and compassion are essential. Those are all healing words. But their function ultimately is, could you start to feel better in life so that you can now learn better in life? And this is what's distinctive about the approach. Now, the reason I'm in this kind of, forgive me if I'm in a kind of mini lecture on this, but the reason it ultimately brings me back to why I need a group is because over the arc of recent history in the therapeutic community, the community as method is gradually eroded, it's faded. Fortunately, even in many good therapeutic community programs, I do see healing effects. People come in, they feel safe, they basically feel they can maybe start something again, but then when you turn to the other large requirement with how much teaching is really going on here, you begin to see the erosion. And it's not simply an opinion. We now know that these programs many of them can't go 12 months. They're not going to get funded 12 months. And we knew that in the early years, if you're really going to learn enough to change your lifestyle and identity, you're going to need a lot more than 3, 6, or 12 months. So even the very kind of funding of this approach has gotten so seriously in the way of essentially enhancing its effectiveness. In fact, it's decreased its effectiveness. The way, going back to the approach itself, I emphasize this point about the fundamental distinctive ingredient of community as method, a certain kind of therapeutic community which practices community as method, is this ingredient of every participant in this particular community is essentially responsible for teaching the next participant something about themselves. And that means I use you in the positive use of that word, positive word use. I use you, you use me. Why? To learn about myself, to see what attitudes, what behaviors, what emotional mismanagement I've got to focus on, which ways I've been false. This is is the fundamental ingredient. This we do not see now in most of the programs that essentially call themselves therapeutic communities today. There are factors which are both endogenous, exogenous, interior and external to the approach that have contributed to this. You're going to be surprised about my thoughts on this, I think. The external factors that have affected the therapeutic community's evolution are pretty obvious, and that is that therapeutic communities from the first days essentially managed to convince, at least temporarily, the society that this was a long-term approach because we were dealing with individuals who needed to focus on changing entire lifestyles and not simply removing a symptom, you know what I mean? It's not even a question of even stopping using drugs. It was a question of individuals who were given the opportunity to change their whole lifestyle. That was not going to be accomplished in 6 months or 9 months or 12 months. And for many years, the therapeutic community was seen, in quotes, as long-term residential treatment. And that simply made the point that this was one of the few approaches that was committed to the idea of 18 to 24 months of an involved process where you're going to change. There was no other approach like that, unless you want to use methadone maintenance as a kind of parallel, which is you always have to be on methadone if you're not going to use heroin. Well, that whole idea that transformation, long-term change, which needed support, required funding, gradually was under assault as the funding climate changed, and an associated external issue, which is that even though we produced a lot of very, very powerful research, convincing research, showing that long-term treatment, a long-term therapeutic community was a powerful approach, showing that time and time again in individual and collective studies, inevitably the funding pattern changed and came down to a point where they didn't want to fund anything, beyond 9 months or so. And the society began to talk itself out of the idea that they even needed that, in this respect, as if we can achieve some of these stable long-term effects with shorter and shorter programs. And then there's another external factor, again, free associating on this. It's a kind of paradoxical factor. As the drug addiction field itself got sophisticated, and moving beyond simply early therapeutic communities, methadone maintenance, and a loose federation of programs called drug-free outpatient treatment. But as the field itself began to evolve and get sophisticated, bringing in more and more typical professional psychologists, psychiatrists, researchers and teachers and so on, non-recovered people who were coming into the field, they began, and as the drug addiction problem began to spread to other segments of the society, so that everybody was now invested, with this whole acculturated problem. There was more and more pressure to develop particular strategies and treatments to deal with all these different subpopulations, and particularly the classical professionals from mental health began to talk about short-term treatment, brief interventions, things that can somehow magically do things in 30 days or 60 days and so on. And there was some evidence to show that. They would claim that they have done some very good studies to show that. And I don't want to argue the evidence in this conversation today, but it was an external factor which contributed to an increasingly diminished view of the relevance and importance of the therapeutic community, a long-term approach. So funding, and then this associated perceptions that supported these funding decisions, which I have a particular beef about, which was that even though we had good therapeutic community research, it was not gold standard research. Now, I don't know whether people would understand that for the moment, but it has to do with the kind of classical biomedical approach that if you're going to essentially develop a treatment for diabetes, you have to get it to the point where it will survive randomized controlled trials, so you increase your certainty that really it's this treatment that's working and not any other effects. And we, therapeutic community research, had a great deal of difficulty in designing, much less implementing, a randomized controlled trial, which was the kind of gold standard of science. And so our research has always been, because this was too difficult to implement, the research took another step, which is let's just follow people as they come into treatment, through treatment, and leave treatment, then follow them 5 and 10 years later and see what happened to their lives, even though we didn't have a kind of randomized control group to compare them to. And now our data, what I just mentioned, that data was very, very compelling data. When we followed people who came through therapeutic communities, we found, over and over again, everywhere in the world, that the longer they stayed in the therapeutic community, the greater the likelihood they were successful when they left, and the longer was their success. We kept reporting that over and over again. It did keep the therapeutic communities in business. It kept them supported to a certain extent in the Western world. But gradually, because we couldn't make these very, very elegant claims like randomized controlled studies, of course we didn't have enough of them, there was always a diminished view from the scientific establishment. It was quite implicit, sometimes explicit, it would come out in debates, but it was certainly implicit that there was, that the therapeutic community, yes, it had a lot of research, But the research, since it was not randomized controlled trial studies, was not that compelling. In effect, they used to say, we don't even know whether the therapeutic community is effective. Language like that would come out. Well, that was an exogenous factor, an external factor, along with the funding factor, which gradually created more and more resistance to therapeutic communities evolving the way they, in my view, should have evolved. Thinking about, let's say, prejudice as a kind of external societal factor, and that the possibility that such prejudice constituted either an overt or covert barrier to the proper development of the therapeutic community. It's a complicated proposition. What we can all agree to, I agree to, is that we certainly know that there is, you can call it prejudice, but there is certainly stereotypical thinking, and biases. Everybody knows that, and that the issue of the populations being served by therapeutic communities, on the one hand, were seen as populations in need, but on the other hand, populations I'm not going to essentially interact with or engage with. That's certainly true, and was true in our field. And therapeutic communities, as a matter of fact, gradually have always been seen as the treatment of last resort, and that is that there are kind of other treatments for different people, and it's the people who've had the greatest difficulty in making it in society who now have developed problems in living, and it's the therapeutic communities are the places that can deal with it. So I would say there's a kind of paradoxical effect of the societal disparity issues in with respect to the therapeutic community. What's paradoxical about it? On the one hand, yes, there's be a great deal of difficulty in fully accepting the very population that's really being treated. But on the other hand, this is the paradoxical part. We'll continue, we need programs like therapeutic communities to deal with those populations. Now, ironically, one of the future steps of the therapeutic community in this arc that's flattened out and gone down is going to be increasingly with the more difficult populations. That is, if the therapeutic communities are still going to insist on federal support, getting support from society on this, it's because they're going to be providing a service to society that no one else will provide. And that will keep, in some ways, that will preserve therapeutic communities, provided they do it right, which is the other part of our conversation we have to get back to. Provided TCs will do it right, they will, again, in my view, get funded, because we're dealing with the issues and populations that nobody else can deal with and would deal with. That's the paradoxical effect. Even though we might not have changed hearts, we've changed minds in that respect, Well, these were some of the exogenous outside factors. I want to just say one or two things about internal factors. Yes, we can make the complaint, as I just did, that about the factors in outside society which have essentially barrierized us from a continued sophisticated evolution, which I really thought needed to occur because we have potentially a very powerful approach to changing people. But we also internally, in my view, made some mistakes. The first generation of therapeutic communities, Synanon and post-Synanon, those all began to essentially feed on the vitality of a new innovative occurrence that was participant-driven, which is wonderful vitality. We're doing this, we're creating things, we're creating our own programs. Great vitality. Begin to feed on that and use that as a nourishment to develop, ultimately, a communities method which would work, as the research showed. So you say, all right, so what happened to that approach? Well, we just listed a few outside reasons that we complained about. But what happened internally to that approach? And here's my first diagnosis. I began to argue about this in the early years. Part of the very disorder that we were dealing with a disorder which involved not only values, behaviors, emotional management, personal growth. We talk a lot about personal growth. We talk about maturation, people growing up. In the early days, people simply didn't get treated in TCs. They grew up in a TC. Part of that is a respectable kind of a agenda to approach. But we lost track on how much the participants themselves, including the leadership, had to continue to mature. What I mean by that is that the direction we began to take in the early days was we began as an alternative treatment, and we had all of the vitality that an alternative position gives you from the outside. It's like it's doing protests on the street. We have all that vitality. Now we start to move toward the mainstream, and I'm one of the culprits in this, because I'm saying we want to move this into the mainstream because we think we can change the world in the mainstream. We have something that could change the world. So I'm part of that problem. But what is that problem? It's an ego problem. And that is, yes, we have a very important treatment, and it should be essentially supported, it should be cultivated, step by step. Watch it now. Not necessarily expanded, but cultivated, step by step, made better and better. The track that we took was not better and better, let's make the treatment better and better, but let's get it bigger and bigger. Let's go out here, let's get to this population, let's get to that population, let's get to that population. All of which, of course, was in one sense legitimate, because we knew we had an approach that was relevant much beyond the issues of addictions, that we can probably help a lot of different people in the shelters and so on, and in the prisons, and even in the mental hospitals. We had an approach here that could do that. But just because we knew there was a potential to the field didn't necessarily mean we had to act as if there was that potential, that we were already there. We weren't already there. We took a lot of contracts to deal with mental health. We took contracts to go into the prison. We took contracts to go into the shelters. We got there, and for a while we were fairly rich, you know what I mean? From the mid-'70s all the way up into the early '90s, maybe even to the 2000s. It was a story of an approach expanding itself, and we understand why they did that, and that is, the rational side was that there was something to give to the world. The irrational side was that we were really not ready to do it. Not at that rate. What did I mean? If we're really talking about community as method, as the powerful approach, then it leads us to the next proposition, which is, well, if it worked, and we know it worked, why did it work? We said, well, we didn't know all the reasons why it worked, but we knew one, and that is, it takes a long time to do this. This is something you don't do in 9 months or 6 months. It takes you a long time. And B, it takes essentially a program which understands how it's doing, what it's doing, and why it's doing that, what we call a high fidelity program. And therefore, you always have to be focusing on how well you are doing what you are doing. Do you know what you are doing, and are you doing it well enough? Well, those questions begin to recede, because as you expand rapidly, you also move almost cosmologically, the universe is expanding. You move away from the strength of the program, which is the strength of this program comes from people who have moved through the program. It's the first labor force. It's the first informed, skilled professional to do this. And these are the people who essentially, we don't have enough of these. We don't graduate them at that kind of rate. It takes 2 years, sometimes 3 years for individuals to really stabilize in their lives, to come back and really have something to give in a program like this. Well, an early program which was not too expansionistically oriented could wait for that. Say, okay, we can build that and we can add another increment. It'll take us 5 years. We now have a labor force. So, said simply, the expansion issue of the therapeutic communities simply did not recognize that it was going to have a profound labor problem. It would not have a skilled workforce that really understood community as method, both conceptually and experientially. They would not have that labor force. We're still suffering from that today. So we expanded, and then we began to essentially, to maintain our expanded position, gradually made more and more negative deals with society and how to stay alive as an organization or an agency doing what it's doing. No matter who the staff were, even if they were non-recovered staff and people who came and worked in therapeutic communities, as I did in the first days, if that staff did not recognize that they were first and foremost in this program a member of the community and not a staff person, but a member of the community whose job function happened to be staff. That's the difference between roles and functions. So that was lost very early. The moment a staff person, even among recovered staff who got into late stages and late stage counseling and senior counseling and directors, a kind of a trigger would switch off for them that they didn't have to grow anymore. Somehow they got to a certain point of development, case closed. I made it already. Never really understanding we never make it already. You know what I'm saying? It's continual, and you've got to be grateful you're in a community that keeps reminding you that your growth is continual, because everybody's always looking at your behaviors and attitudes and seeing in which ways you're false and not false. We lost that within the first decade of the expansion of the therapeutic community. That's what I meant by even at the top. Today, here's one very clear example, not at Amity. I hear still that there are at least staff groups at Amity. But it is not the rule in the field. You go around the therapeutic communities worldwide, and it's a rare program that's running staff groups. Where's the staff in this? You know, what are they getting? They're still now perched up on some hierarchy and watching what's going on down there in terms of the service. The idea, some of you may remember this, but in the early years, it was not only staff groups, but we even had occasions for staff resident groups, together integrated groups, and they happened to be, the format of that group might be an encounter group, which essentially had residents talking to staff about what their behaviors and attitudes, and in terms of even issues that might go as far as abuse of power. Well, the format was there, the venue was there to deal with it, and that's the health of the whole approach. That is community's method. That means in that hats-off encounter, right, the staff person no longer can wear the hat of a person in power. They simply have to listen and be a member of the community about, you know, how people see them. You can't do that today. In fact, you not only see it, there's probably laws against it today. You know what I mean? There's probably insurance laws against it. Who knows what kind of a barrier there is there. But it was one of the most, in my view, one of the most corrosive contributions to the trajectory that I'm talking about. Internally, we still had the option, as you do, we still had the option to keep this as a full community so that every member, including the staff, are part of this community, and we have to have the activities in place to make sure that it's operating that way. We don't. And the future of the field, as long as it doesn't recognize that, as long as it still insists on hierarchical dichotomies between staff and residents, are inherently moving against the very essence of community as method. Which is not to say that a staff person, or who was ever evolved into that role, hasn't got some very special things to teach. They do. Here, let me give you an example. In the training of many of the traditional professionals, which I began to dedicate myself toward around 1990, 1995, when I saw that the arc was going to go the way it was going, and that we were going to get more and more traditional professionals, psychologists, counselors, social workers, and so on, coming in, there's going to be and less of recovered staff who are going to be the prominent staff, because this was part of the expansion. I didn't give up. I said, well, the next best thing we can do is at least try to train that staff, those individuals, so-called non-recovered staff, try to train them in community as method in a very fundamental way, which is, the first thing they needed to hear as part of the training curriculum was, regardless of what discipline you come from, psychology or social work or psychiatry or nursing, that discipline is only, see that as a particular function that you can provide in this community. You might be able to provide some nursing when we need that. You can provide maybe some special crisis counseling for a mental health episode if that's needed. As Phoenix House used to use me every so often to call me in if there was a mental health episode of some sort. But your first role here was as community as member, and watch how difficult it has been for traditional professional staff to understand that particular requirement. That meant that all of the major therapeutic and teaching effects that occur in this program are occurring mediated through essentially the community. You as a particular staff member are not a provider in this. You're not providing anything. Your presence, your identity in this community is going to be used like everybody else's presence and identity in this community, as someone we can learn from. They could not accept the idea that they were not going to provide a treatment. We always were constantly correcting counselors, social work counselors, psychology counselors, about how often they would meet with people and what they were doing in those counseling sessions, because they were inadvertently undermining the community. It took years to even get the whole concept of community as method to be intellectually understood by essentially traditional professional staff, that there's a methodology here. That methodology requires that you are no longer the first line provider, it's the community. Your real major role in this community is to facilitate community as method. It's not to do treatment, it's not to do counseling, but learn how to facilitate community as method. Well, to the extent that we were able to teach that, the TC has been able to hang on to as far as it has gone. But at the current status of it, we know that it is not enough in terms of its future. There's other, I think, larger scale changes would have to occur. The phrase collateral benefit I coined to make the point that it was not only the target person in the therapeutic community, the client who's working themselves through the therapeutic community, but their ultimate change would have widespread positive effects beyond simply their change. And it's kind of obvious, on their relationships, on their children, as citizens, as tax-paying citizens, as individuals who might now adhere closer to living healthy lives rather than non-healthy lives. So, and they would have, as a result, that if their life changes, some portion of, let's say, as an example, their family life would change, and if their family life changes, they are already now essentially facilitating a process of transgenerational change. And that is the next generation will be positively changed. And so the potential power of really helping one person make a real change in their lives would have collateral benefits that may not even be measurable, but certainly should be observed and talked about. The special case of, let's say, a staff continuing to engage in community as method itself, there you can see it's quite obvious. As a matter of fact, there's kind of empirical data that staff people who have fully participated and engaged in therapeutic communities as community as method were themselves undergoing continual change in their lives, not only in terms of their own personal stability and their mental health, if you like, but in fact their own professional growth. They were learning skills. They were learning approaches of how to help people change, which was far beyond their work even in the therapeutic community. So many of them would say they changed private practices and the way they worked in private practices if you were kind of a provider. They would go into organizations or into schools, and basically now, as their experience in the therapeutic community already influenced what they were doing there. So the collateral benefits never measured, never reported on, never talked about. I mean, you never see that in the methadone maintenance. What did the staff person learn in methadone maintenance except about how to dose? The concept of learning from students is a pedagogical one. It's not a psychological one. Earlier, it's really philosophical. It's from the earliest days of Socrates, you know what I mean? Learning from your students. And we know the truth of that. And it's a simple truth. And that is, it's your students who will help you see who you are, if you will let them. If you stay in some kind of an image, if you either hold on to an authoritative image, if you hold on to some kind of a provider image, I'm the treater, I'm the provider, you're the consumer, you're the patient. If you hold on to the educator, I'm the educator, you limit two things. You limit what happens to you, you limit what happens to them. So the whole idea of learning from your students, I believe, should be transmuted into something else, which is you keep engaging with each other and with the responsibility that you have to use me to help you and I have to use you to help me. And as long as you hold on to that, because particularly as very specific examples like students can always detect falseness, you know what I mean, in parents and in teachers and everyone else. And I need people around me to pull my covers and detect the falseness. And so that these very, very profound and elegant truisms that we're talking about don't get a real chance to essentially get illustrated. Those are kind of prizes that we can't even reach for now because most of the TCs are not where they should be. Communities method has a lot to teach the larger society about how to live, what we call right living. We have a lot to teach a society that's essentially engaged in a very, very, very terrible convulsion itself, which is, you know, we have lost community, we accept the fact that we got many, many casualties, and we just now want a mental health system and a criminal justice system to somehow fix it. We still have something to teach on this.